Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please be seated. This is case number 65189H064, State of Missouri versus Bonnie Elizabeth Parker. Is the State of Missouri ready to proceed?
We are, Your Honor.
Is Defendant Parker ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
State may proceed with opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. You have no doubt arrived here after a very long and arduous voir dire process, so we're thankful for your patience during that process. And I'm going to thank you in advance for the patience and attention to detail I know that you are all going to show today. My name is Jake Kohut, and along with my co-counsel, Scott Fox, we are going to be representing the state of Missouri in the case of Missouri versus Bonnie Parker. We're here today to try Miss Parker on charges of murder in the death of W.D. Murphy, who was a trooper for the Missouri State Motorcycle Patrol. And today we're going to talk a lot about fantasy and reality. There are certain things that Bonnie Parker has said, and she'll tell you today. She'll tell you a little bit about her background, about growing up in a dusty suburb of Dallas, as she describes it, about how her father was no longer with her family whenever she was a young child, and she moved with her mother under very difficult circumstances. How she dropped out of high school at the age of 15. How, at some point in time, she became enamored with the stories of the Barrow gang and eventually met Clyde Barrow. And when she met him, she felt an attraction, and she'll tell you today, she felt an attraction to Clyde Barrow because she felt that he, very similar to her, had fantastical dreams that were crushed by the harsh bite of reality. That was his appeal. And in fact, Ms. Parker will tell you today that she enjoyed the stories of the Barrow gang, that she went along with Clyde Barrow and his gang, that she romanticized the exploits of the gang in poems and in statements that she made to reporters that she can tell you about today, how the gang would kidnap journalists and she would make statements to them. And in fact, in her own words, she has said that the journalists had the time of their lives, that it was the highlight of their lives to be kidnapped by the Barrow gang. That's what Bonnie Parker says. That's her fantasy. We're also going to talk about reality. And the reality is that Ms. Parker is not married to Mr. Barrow. Bonnie is not married to Clyde. She's married to a man named Roy Thornton. When she dropped out of high school at the age of 15, she actually did so, and she married this man, Roy Thornton, and 2.5 years later, he was out of her life. She moved back in with her mother and started working, and that's when she met Clyde Barrow. So while the fantasy says that she may have dropped out of high school and became enamored with a life of crime on the road with the Barrow gang, in fact, she was already married to a man who was not Clyde Barrow. And what the Barrow gang was perhaps not as romantic as you might expect from reading the poems that Bonnie wrote while she was on the road with the Barrow gang. Instead, the Barrow gang is well known for having robbed, for having kidnapped, for having killed. They were not unjustly persecuted and ambushed by police. Rather, they were being persecuted for their unlawful activities by lawful authorities. Bonnie Parker will testify today that she was a proud member of the Barrow gang. She was on the road with them for well over a year until the events of April 1st of 1934. We'll get back to Ms. Parker's involvement in the Barrow gang in a moment. But first, I'd like to discuss the facts of April 1st of 1934. Here are the facts as will be presented to you today by several witnesses. The Barrow gang was in Grapevine, Missouri. They were there to visit with Miss Parker's family. Miss Parker, Clyde Barrow, and Henry Methvin were all sitting in a brand new black Ford V8 that was parked on the side of the road. It was parked near the intersection of Dove Road and Highway 114 in Grapevine, Missouri. The car was parked off the side of the road. 3 Missouri State troopers passed the car. 2 of the troopers returned to the car to check it out. Both of the troopers were shot and killed right next to the car before they had even unholstered or had a chance to use their weapons. Those are what the facts are going to tell you today. And the facts are going to show you that of the 3 people in that car, Bonnie Parker, Clyde Barrow, and Henry Methvin, Henry Methvin's versions of events is slightly different. But I'd like for you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to keep in mind that Bonnie and Clyde's versions of the story, although it's different from Henry Methvin's story, doesn't necessarily add up in terms of their character as it had been previously described. Now I'll tell you what their stories are. Bonnie Parker is going to be able to testify on the stand today that she was inside of the black Ford V8, but that she exited the vehicle after the shootings had already taken place. And she's going to tell you that she was not the one who killed Trooper W.D. Murphy on April 1st of 1934. Now, Clyde Barrow is going to tell you a very similar thing. He's going to tell you that Bonnie Parker was in the vehicle during the shootings of the officers and then exited the vehicle. Now, Henry's version is slightly different. Henry's version is that she was in the vehicle whenever one of the troopers was killed. Please keep in mind that Miss Barrow is not on trial today for the murder of both of those officers. She was on trial for the murder of Trooper W.D. Murphy. W.D. Murphy was a state trooper who was off his motorcycle. He was lying on the ground. He was trying to crawl. He was injured. And Henry Methvin is going to take the stand today and tell you that Bonnie Parker is the one who shot Trooper W.D. Murphy as he was crawling after he had already been shot outside of the vehicle. So according to Henry Methvin's version of events, it was Bonnie, and not Henry Methvin, who shot and killed Trooper W.D. Murphy. That is in keeping, you might notice, with some things that Bonnie and Clyde both have to say today. Now, Mr. Barrow is going to be testifying via video deposition, and he's going to tell you today that Bonnie has been with the gang for some time prior to April 1st of 1934. That she had been with them during January of 1933, whenever Bonnie is going to tell you on the stand today that Clyde Barrow shot and killed a deputy. She was with the gang in April of 1933 when there was a raid on one of Clyde's relatives' farms and 2 police officers were killed. Now, Miss Barrow is not on trial for that today. But she had been with the gang long enough. Now, her story also is that she exited the vehicle to look after the officers. She'll tell you today that she wanted to make sure that they were okay, see if there was anything she could do. Is that in keeping with her presence during the April 1933 raid on the Joplin farm? Is that in keeping with her presence during that raid where 2 cops were killed? Is that in keeping with her character whenever the gang escaped after a firefight in which Bonnie Parker herself will tell you today that she fired covering fire for other members of the Barrow gang at police officers who had surrounded the Joplin farm? I would like for you to keep all of those facts in your mind today as you consider the testimony of Henry Methvin, Bonnie Parker, and Clyde Barrow. Now, in addition to the 3 people in the car, there were 2 eyewitnesses. There was a Margaret Giggle and a William Schiffer. Now, Mr. Schiffer is going to tell you on the stand today, he'll be the first witness you hear from, that he's a pilot, that he has excellent vision, and that he saw 1 woman and 2 men outside of the black Ford V8. And he'll tell you that he was about 100 feet away. His farm is very near the intersection of Dove Road and Highway 140. He heard the shots. He'll tell you that he came running, and he was able to hide about 100 yards away, and he clearly saw 2 men and 1 woman outside of a vehicle, and that it was a woman who fired the shots that fatally injured Trooper W.D. Murphy. Now, the other eyewitness, Margaret Giggle, says that she has 20/20 vision with glasses on, that she was a couple hundred yards away from where the scene of the accident took place, that she was in a car driving past the scene, and she didn't even see Bonnie Parker outside of the vehicle. That's what she'll testify to today. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Henry Methvin testifies that Bonnie Parker was outside of the car. Bonnie Parker testifies that she was outside of the car. Clyde Barrow testifies that Bonnie was outside of the car. And William Schieffer, the only eyewitness who wasn't directly involved, also saw Miss Parker outside the car. The only person who didn't see her outside the car was Margaret Giggle. That's a fact. And I would like for you to keep that in mind today as you consider the testimony of the eyewitnesses. Finally, Miss Parker will claim the defense of duress today. I would like for you to keep in mind the following facts. First, Miss Parker had been with the Barrow gang for some time. Now, I told you earlier we'd return to Miss Parker's involvement in the Barrow gang, and this is it. Here we are. Miss Parker was with the Barrow gang in January of 1933. She'll tell you herself today that Clyde Barrow fired shots that fatally injured a deputy. She'll tell you that she stayed with them, and then until 4 months later, in April of 1933, there was a raid on one of Clyde's relatives' farms that she was present for, and that during that raid, 2 cops were killed, and that Bonnie Parker herself, as she'll testify today, laid down covering fire for the rest of the gang as they escaped. 4 months later, July of 1933, she was present with the gang during shootouts in Kansas City and another in Iowa. Later, still in 1933, she herself was shot in the legs during another firefight. And finally, in January of 1934, she could testify about an incident that she has some knowledge of. Now, she wasn't present for this particular raid, but there was a raid on an Eastham prison in which Mr. Barrow had formerly been an inmate. She has some knowledge of this raid, and she's going to be able to tell you that from January of 1933 until January of 1934, and all the way up until April 1st of 1934, she was with the Barrow gang. I want you to keep in mind today, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, throughout the presentation of the evidence, that Miss Parker had many opportunities to leave, and she never did. Fantasy and reality. There's what Miss Parker is going to say, and there's what actually happened. I'd like for you to keep that in mind today during the presentation of the evidence. And at the end of the evidence, we, the state, is going to ask that you find Bonnie Parker guilty of the murder of Trooper W.D. Murphy. Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor.
Defendant may proceed with opening statement.
May it please the court?
Counselor?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paige Oster, and this is my colleague, Ben Trachtenberg. Together, we represent Miss Bonnie Parker. Tonight, you will hear the story of a woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The prosecution has already told you that you'll be hearing from 6 witnesses tonight. But it is important for you to remember that only 5 of those witnesses were present at the scene when the shooting occurred. Bonnie Parker, Clyde Barrow, Henry Methvin, William Schieffer, and Margaret Geigel. The 6th witness, Officer Polk Ivy, only arrived at the scene following the shooting. And the evidence will show that contrary to the evidence that the prosecution will put forward, Bonnie Parker did not shoot anyone. The person who actually pulled that trigger was none other than the prosecution's star witness, Henry Methvin. Now, the prosecution already told you that Henry Methvin and William Schieffer will be testifying for them. But what the prosecution failed to tell you is that William Schieffer will admit that he was a good 100 yards away from the intersection of Highway 114 and Dove Road, and that following the incident, he couldn't identify Miss Parker in a police lineup. What the prosecution also failed to tell you is that Henry Methvin, their other witness, is a longtime criminal who would be facing the death penalty if he hadn't agreed to testify today for the prosecution. Now, these 2 witnesses are the only people that were actually present at the scene of the shooting that the prosecution will rely on in its attempt to prove that Miss Parker murdered an officer. Tonight, you will also get the opportunity to hear from Bonnie Parker. And she'll admit to you that she was present on April 1st when those two officers were murdered, but she never pulled a trigger. She'll tell you that on April 1st, she was parked near the intersection of Dove Road and Highway 114 with Clyde Barrow, and that their associate, Henry Methvin, was standing outside. The group was near Grapevine so that Bonnie could see her family for Easter. And while they were waiting, Bonnie and Clyde fell asleep in the car. While they were asleep, two police officers approached the car on motorcycles. And upon seeing the officers, Henry Methvin quietly woke Clyde up and left Bonnie asleep in the car. Soon afterward, Bonnie awoke to the sound of gunfire. When she looked out the window, Clyde and Henry were standing over the bodies of two officers. While it appeared that one of the officers was already dead, the other officer was still moving. Henry then took a .45 out of his waistband, pointed it at the officer, and shot him 2 more times. By the time Bonnie could get out of the car, both of the officers were already dead. And Bonnie will tell you that Henry Methvin, the prosecution's witness that is testifying today in order to avoid the death penalty, was the one who shot and killed Officer Murphy. Now tonight you'll also hear from Clyde Barrow. And Clyde will tell you that he fell asleep in the car on April 1st and that Henry woke him up to tell him that the two officers were pulling up behind the car. Clyde then got out, and Henry shot and killed both of the officers. Now, Clyde will tell you that Bonnie isn't a murderer, and that Henry Methvin is lying about the events that transpired on April 1st, 1934. And finally, you'll hear from Margaret Geigel, the former mayor of Grapevine, whose car was stopped at the intersection of Highway 114 and Dove Road when Henry shot Officer Murphy with his handgun. She'll tell you that a man, not Miss Parker, killed the officers. Now, Miss Geigel is an unbiased, church-going woman who knew Officer Murphy personally. The last thing that she would want to do is to prevent justice from being served by testifying falsely for Miss Parker. Now tonight, we won't try to tell you that Bonnie is a saint, that she's perfect, or that she's never made mistakes. Indeed, she made a huge mistake in getting involved with Clyde Barrow. But that doesn't make her a murderer. At the end of this trial, my colleague will ask you to find Bonnie not guilty. And I'm confident that after listening to the entirety of the evidence, you will agree that while Bonnie may be guilty of bad judgment, she's not guilty of murder. Thank you.
State, call your first witness.
Your Honor, the state calls William Schieffer.
Would you come forward, sir, and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated.
Your Honor, may I proceed?
You may proceed.
Thank you. Good evening. Mr. Schieffer?
Schaefer, yes.
Schaeffer. Mr. Schaeffer, how are you this evening?
Very good. How are you?
I'm doing quite well, and I'm correct that your first name is William, is that right?
That's correct. William.
Mr. Schaefer, could you tell me how old you are?
Yes, I'm 42 years old.
And could you tell the jury a little bit about what you do?
Sure, I'm a farmer right here in Boone County, the town of Grapevine, Missouri. I do all sorts of farming, a little of this and that, cattle, raise some horses, grow corn and other crops.
Thank you. Do you have any hobbies that you particularly enjoy?
I do for a while. I used to live in Chicago, and while I was there, I made some amount of money trading on the stock market there. And with that money, I used that to pay for flying lessons, and I continue to do that today to some extent. And that's one thing that I enjoy most in life is flying up above the earth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schaefer. Mr. Schaefer, why did you move from Chicago to Grapevine?
Well, I don't know if you've been to Chicago, but we have had some trouble there the past few years with gangsters, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, others, and it's a violent place. I had made some amount of money, and so I decided to get back to a rural part of the country. Beautiful Boone County was what I chose to get away from that kind of activity. Of course, you can imagine how disturbed and shocked and upset I was to have this kind of violence come right now to my doorstep in Grapevine.
I can imagine. Mr. Schaefer, had you ever, before April 1st of 1934, heard the name Bonnie Parker?
You know, I don't know.
And
I suspect I had heard the name Bonnie Parker.
do you think you had ever seen her before?
I don't believe I've seen her before.
So there's no reason that you would have recognized her then if you would have just seen her on the street?
No, we have not been familiar with one another.
Thank you. I'd like to speak with you about the events of April 1st of 1934. Could you tell me what you recall about that day?
I was out in the field, had just returned to eat some lunch, and I heard some gunshots. And that, of course, surprised me. I ran to the house, grabbed my gun, turned back around, and headed out to the direction that I had heard these gunshots. I ran and approached a clump of trees, and from that vantage point, I saw a Ford V8 sitting there, nice new one, a couple of police motorcycles. I saw two, what I now know are officers lying on the ground. I saw one big man, and I had my gun there. I could tell what had happened, and I was about to use my gun, and I was surprised at that moment when I saw a woman get out of the car, walk over to one of the officers that was moving at that point, appeared to be alive. She started pulling the trigger, time and time again, screaming like a maniac. It was a horrible sight and sound, and I will never forget what she said, what she screamed. She was laughing, and she said, "His head bounced like a rubber ball."
Mr. Schaefer, I'd like to take you back just a moment. Outside of the, I believe you said it was a black vehicle. What kind of car was it?
Yes, it was a Ford V8.
And how many people did you initially see outside of the vehicle?
Now, I initially saw one big man, and now there was a second man there too.
Okay.
And then, in addition, the woman I saw, which now it turns out was Miss Bonnie Parker.
Would you recognize Miss Parker if you saw her today?
Well, I do see her there. Yes.
Could you be more specific?
Yes,
maybe describe what she's wearing if she's in the courtroom?
That's right. She's sitting over there wearing a red dress and has a small hat on her, dark hair.
Will the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant, Bonnie Parker?
Has the witness identified the defendant? Yes, sir. The record will so reflect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Schieffer, do you recall about how far away you were from the vehicle whenever you saw the things you just described?
Yes, my estimation is about 100 yards, and I could see them clearly. Of course, I'm a pilot, you know. I at least take classes flying airplanes, and they don't just let anyone do that. You have to have good vision to do that, and I do have nearly perfect vision.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Schieffer. Nothing further from the state at this time.
Cross-exam.
Good evening, Mr. Schaefer.
Good evening.
And it is Schaefer, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Okay. William Schaefer.
Now, if you could just put up the slide. Permission to approach, Your Honor.
Permission is granted.
Now, Mr. Schaefer, I'll actually give you a copy of this as well because I know that's difficult for you to see.
Thank you.
I'm now showing you what is a representation of the intersection of Highway 114 and Dove Road. Now, this is the intersection where the shooting occurred, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And on this map, we have these newfangled things, these laser pointers. Highway 114, it runs west and east on this diagram, correct?
That's correct. Highway 114, and it crosses there at the intersection with Dove Road.
And that's the way that Highway 114 runs in real life also, correct? Not just on this diagram.
That's correct.
And on this map, Dove Road runs north and south, correct?
Right now, I'm not a surveyor, but I think this is roughly correct.
Okay, so Dove Road runs north and south on this diagram. And does it also run north and south in real life?
Yes, ma'am.
And if you wanted to go to Grapevine, you would take 114 east, correct?
That's correct.
So what it says up here, east to Grapevine, that's correct.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate statement.
Okay. Now your property is to the south of Highway 114, correct?
That's correct.
And it's to the west of Dove Road, correct?
That's correct.
So your property would be about in this corner,
That's
correct?
right, that southwest corner there.
And you were on your property, you testified earlier, before the shooting occurred, correct?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
And when you heard the shots, that's when you approached this copse of trees, correct?
That's correct.
Now, it's true that that copse of trees is to the south of Highway 114
Yes.
and to the west of Dove Road,
Yes,
correct?
that's all true.
Okay. So on the map, what is labeled as the copse of trees would be about where you were when the shooting actually occurred, correct?
That is correct.
Now, you previously testified that that copse of trees was about 100 yards away from the intersection, correct?
That's correct.
So there's a arrow right here, and it's marked 100 yards.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that an accurate, that arrow, is that correct?
I think that's roughly, as far as I see, that's showing that those trees are about 100 yards away from that intersection where the murder occurred.
All right, so plus or minus is about the length of a football field distance from the copse of trees to the intersection.
I think that's right.
Now, Mr. Schaefer, is this a fair and accurate representation of the intersection and where you were on April 1st, 1934?
I do believe it's fair and accurate. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Schaefer, I have a couple more questions about what you saw. Now, you stated again that you were a good 100 yards away from Highway 114 and Dove Road, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you were wearing glasses that day, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And they're the same glasses that you're wearing today, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And these are normal prescription glasses.
Yes, I have a slight I have a slight need for glasses, and without the glasses, I might have trouble seeing something that was 100 yards away. But once I have these glasses, I have nearly perfect vision.
So these are normal prescription glasses.
Yes, that's
correct?
right.
And these aren't any special glasses that help you see an extraordinary distance, are they?
No, that's right. Although my vision with them is nearly perfect, it is not superhuman.
Correct.
Okay.
So you can't see an extraordinary distance, just
Objection.
an ordinary distance.
Objection, Your Honor. Could I, said opposing counsel, define what she means by extraordinary? I think that's a little unclear.
Extraordinary would be longer than ordinary. Extraordinary.
Ma'am, what I do know is that from my vantage point, I could see a woman, and I could hear her voice, and I saw her shoot.
Okay, but that's a little bit different than the question I asked, which is, those glasses that you have on,
Yes, ma'am.
they don't allow you to see an extraordinary distance, correct?
The doctors, all I know is that the doctors tell me with these glasses, I have nearly perfect vision.
Now, you also didn't use a telescope that evening, or that afternoon, excuse me, correct?
That's correct.
So you didn't have any way of enhancing your vision other than these normal prescription glasses during the shooting, correct?
That's correct, ma'am.
Now, you also testified that you were able to hear Miss Parker from that copse of trees, correct?
Yes, I could hear her, and I saw what appeared to be a woman and heard a high-pitched voice.
But you weren't using any sort of audio enhancement device to listen, correct?
That's correct.
You don't have any special hearing aids that allow you to hear extraordinary
That's
things.
right. I do not know Thomas Edison.
And you were 100 yards away from the intersection, correct?
That's my estimation, about 100 yards.
And you were behind a copse of trees.
Yeah, I positioned myself there so that it would be less likely I would be seen and so that I could watch to see what was happening. Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to move now to admit this map as Defendant's Exhibit 1.
I would object, Your Honor, on the basis that this map is clearly not to scale. I would be willing to not object if it appeared that the road itself was not 100 yards wide.
Your Honor, defense counsel is willing to stipulate that this map is not, in fact, drawn to scale.
The exhibit will be received.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Schaefer, you're not from Grapevine, are you?
Well, I live here now, but as I testified earlier, I was raised in Chicago and worked in Chicago for a number of years before moving down here.
So you had just recently moved here when the shooting occurred, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And like you said, you moved here from Chicago, correct?
That's correct.
To get away from, I think you were talking about gangsters, correct?
That is correct. Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, gangsters.
Now, Mr. Schaefer, you had heard, though, of Bonnie and Clyde before, correct?
I had heard of yes, they have been in the news, and before watching a picture show, sometimes they come on the screen.
So you knew what Bonnie and Clyde looked like?
You know, I don't know that I knew that she was, I knew that they, right, they both kind of had that movie star look, you might say, but truthfully, I don't know that I can really tell one movie star from another.
But you said that you had seen Bonnie and Clyde on a picture screen, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
But when it came to identify Bonnie in a lineup, you couldn't identify her as the shooter, could you?
That's right. When they lined up a set of individuals, I could not identify which one was in fact Bonnie.
No further questions.
Briefly.
Redirect.
Now, Mr. Schieffer, how many police officers did you say you saw outside of that black Ford V8?
2 police officers.
And how many other people did you see?
I saw 3 other individuals, 2 men and 1 woman.
At 100 yards,
Yes.
can you tell the difference between 2 men and 1 woman,
Yes, I can tell the difference.
even if you couldn't necessarily see her face?
That's right. There's a difference in the woman was smaller stature, and was wearing a dress.
No further questions. Thank you, Mr.
You may
Schieffer.
step down, sir.
Thank you.
State, call your next witness.
Your Honor, the state calls Henry Methvin.
Raise your right hand, sir. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth so help you God?
Well, yes, sir, I do.
Please be seated.
Okay.
Good evening, Mr. Methvin.
Well, good evening, Counselor.
Please state your full name for the record.
I will, indeed. Can I scoot this up a little bit, or scoot this to me? I'll get underway. It is Henry, Henry, Methvin, Methvin.
Where do you live, Mr. Methvin?
Well, currently I am a ward of the state in a penitentiary.
How long have you been a ward of the state penitentiary?
Well, you have to excuse me. You kind of get lost in yourself in that kind of environment. I don't right remember exactly how long I've been there, but I assume it's been for a spell.
Mr. Methvin, are you familiar with an individual by the name of Clyde Barrow?
Oh, yeah, I know Clyde.
How'd you meet Clyde Barrow?
Well, another penitentiary story, if you would entertain, or let me entertain you, I suppose you could humor me. I was serving some time for one of my transgressions with the law, and just so happened, my soon-to-be friend, Clyde Barrow, he came in to free one of his friends to spring him from that institution, and I seized the opportunity.
So you met Mr. Barrow while you were in the institution, is that correct?
Yes, sir, I do believe that's where I met
And
Mr.
what
Barrow.
was Mr. Barrow doing the first time you saw him?
Well, I don't right remember what he was doing. I assume he was running and carrying a gun, yelling something.
Did you have a long acquaintance with Mr. Barrow?
We ran together, I suppose you could say, in and out of the world for about 2 years after that, so that was in 1932, I think.
So you were indeed a member of the Barrow gang, is that correct?
Well, we didn't really call ourselves a gang. I mean, we were just doing what we do and trying to live a little life and get a little slice of the American dream back.
Isn't it true that your version of living a little life is running around shooting people and robbing and stealing things?
Well, you say it's so crass. That's what I've been convicted of, though, yes.
In fact, isn't it true that you're here today testifying as part of the state's case because you're willing to tell the story of what happened on April 1st, 1934?
Yes, sir. I want to clear up the confusion. I think there's quite an ominous cloud of lies and deceit, and I would like to lift it.
Okay, but before you do that, I'd like you to tell me a little bit about Bonnie Parker. Are you familiar with her?
Yeah, I know that doll.
And is she here in the courtroom today?
Oh, sure as a sparrow fly she is. She's right over there. Looking quite fetching in the dress, Bonnie.
And would you say that you became familiar with Bonnie Parker as part of the Barrow gang?
Yes, sir.
Did you spend much time with Bonnie as part of the Barrow gang?
Well, I mean, we did everything together. We more like a family, friends. So we drank together, we had fun together, we did everything.
Did your version of fun also include shooting weapons?
Well, have you ever shot a weapon? It's pretty fun, yeah.
Did your version of fun also include holding up stores?
Well, that's what we did, I assume. It was kind of fun.
And was Miss Parker with the gang during some of these jobs?
She was, of course. Her and Clyde were like two peas in a pod.
Did you form an opinion of Bonnie Parker in her capacity for engaging in violence?
Oh, she sure was a Valkyrie. I've never seen a dame with a bloodlust kind of like that.
Why do you say she had a bloodlust, sir?
Well, there were times where even I, or maybe some other of the fellas, would hold back, but not Bonnie. I don't know if she wanted to prove she could rise above.
Objection, Your Honor. Is the defendant planning to give the witness planning to give a parade of character evidence?
The response of the witnesses.
Your Honor, the defense has alleged that Ms. Parker was under duress during her time with the Barrow gang. We're seeking to establish that she was not only not under duress, but that she was a willing participant.
Your Honor, we have no intention whatsoever of bringing forth a defense of duress.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Your Honor, prior to the trial, we were served with papers that specifically instructed.
The objection is sustained.
Mr. Methvin, did you ever hear Bonnie Parker talk about what she was doing while she was with the Barrow gang?
I'm sorry, while she was what?
While you were having fun with Bonnie, did she ever say words?
Well, of course. I mean, it's hard to really have fun if you don't talk. But yes, of course, Bonnie talked all the time. We joked about the scores we made. We joked about the days we've had and the roads we traveled.
Did she ever give you any words to lead you to believe that she enjoyed her reputation for violence?
Objection, Your Honor. Is this even relevant?
It is sustained.
Did you ever observe her habits, sir?
Of course.
Which habits did you observe?
Well, she sure shooting did like to drink some sour mash with a couple lemon peels. I mean, that, a little too citrusy for my taste. And she also definitely had a habit of, I guess, as you would say, joining in on the shooting individuals.
Objection, Your Honor.
It is not responsive. It's sustained.
Did she have a habit for smoking?
I think we all kind of do. Do you mind? Is that okay?
In fact, we do mind.
I didn't know that kind of legislation was in the works. Yeah, I believe she did. She smoked with us.
And Mr. Methvin, what did she smoke?
Well, I mean, smoked on all sorts of things that happened by on the course of our travels. I mean, we visited our fair share of dens. That's what you're asking. And at the same time, I think we smoked tobacco. There are some other words for things that we smoked, but should I continue to divulge?
No, I think that'll be enough. Thanks. Your Honor, permission to approach the witness.
Permission is granted. For the record, for both counsel, you don't need to request permission of the court to approach the witnesses.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Sir, I'm handing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit Number 1.
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, this is definitely one of the stogies that Bonnie was so fond of smoking all the time. Yeah.
How do you know that's one of the stogies that she used to smoke?
Well, shoot. She was the only one who was about to smoke these kind. I mean, these are hand-rolled, aren't they? Yeah. I usually did it myself and just smoked some regular tobacco.
Would it surprise you to learn that this particular stogie was retrieved from the scene of the crime?
Don't surprise me much, no.
Your Honor, the state moves to introduce State's Exhibit number 1.
We have no objection, Your Honor.
The exhibit will be received.
Mr. Methvin, I would like to take you through a little bit of the details of April 1st, 1934. If you would, please elaborate for the jury. Where were you and what were you doing on April 1st?
I assume April 1st is the day in question. My memory in prison has kind of stripped me of such details. But on that particular occasion, if it's indeed that, we were tired. We had just made our rounds, so to say, in the Midwest coming through Missouri. And we had just had jacked us a nice deuce. It was quite a little more fancy than I was used to. And we were tired, so we pulled over on the highway. We decided to pass around a bottle. Bonnie, of course, she was chewing her lemon peels, smoking on a cigar, making herself look like more man than poor old Henry over here. And all of a sudden, Clyde noticed, and so did I, that two coppers had come up alongside on the motorcycles, and we decided we had to get out of the car. So Clyde tells me to take him, and we had never used that kind of term before, so I thought it was a new exciting way to say, hey, take care of these fellas. So I shot one of the officers. I believe it was in the shoulder. And at that point, Clyde got quite agitated and upset with me, and I was surprised, and he said, Henry, what'd you do that for? And I was confused, and I thought, well, of course I had to shoot him. But at that point, before I could really react, Clyde had shot the officer that I wounded, killing him. And by this point, I don't know when Bonnie came out of the car, but she was out. And after Clyde had disabled the second cop by shooting him as well, that's when Bonnie decided to kill the second officer. And howbeit she laughed like a banshee. It was quite it was terrible.
Mr. Methvin, what weapon did you use to shoot at the officers?
Well, I suppose I had I don't know if it was registered or street legal, but I had a firearm that I had modified myself.
Was it a handgun or a rifle, sir?
Well, that day I was carrying both, but I believe it was with a handgun.
What weapon did Clyde Barrow shoot with?
I suppose, well, you have to forgive me, when you shoot guns so often you're not really paying attention to the make and model, but I think he had a rifle as well. But we were all carrying both that day.
And when Ms. Parker emerged out of the car, what weapon did she have?
Well, it was a rifle.
Did you earlier give a deposition in this case, sir?
I believe so.
Did you, in that deposition, say that you were going to give all of the truth in order for you to be able to come here today in exchange for your plea agreement?
Well, yes, sir, and that's what I'm doing.
Would it surprise you to learn that in your deposition you said that Ms. Parker had a handgun?
Wouldn't surprise me one bit. Like I said, I can't remember the makes and models. We used a lot of guns.
Okay, well, maybe you
Objection,
can...
Your Honor. Does the state mean to impeach its own witness and say he can't remember what's happening?
I think so.
We're done with that line of questioning, Your Honor. Maybe this will help you remember a little bit. Do you recognize this?
Oh, yeah, that was a bottle that we were drinking out of.
How do you know that was the bottle you were drinking out of?
Well, you usually don't remember, usually don't forget a wax seal like this. Not many distillers are willing to put such a mark on it of a maker.
I see. Would it surprise you to learn that this bottle was located outside the vehicle on the ground near the slain officers?
Well, no, that wouldn't surprise me, just like the cigar butt, I guess.
Your Honor, state moves for introduction of State's Exhibit number 2.
We have no objection, Your Honor.
2 is received.
Mr. Methvin, you stated that Ms. Parker had a habit of sucking on lemons. You recall that statement?
Yes, sir.
Would you take what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 3? those look like the sorts of things that Ms. Parker would suck on?
All these lemons? I mean, kind of thing she'd suck on. Yes, it was lemons.
But it surprised you to learn that these lemons were retrieved near the bodies of the slain officers.
Well, not the way she was laughing. It makes a lot of sense, actually.
Your Honor, State moves for introduction of State's Exhibit Number 3.
No objection, Your Honor.
3 is received.
Mr. Methvin, you're testifying here today as part of an agreement with the state that you would not be have the death penalty imposed for your participation in these crimes. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Just one more thing. Mr. Methvin, how tall are you?
Well, I'm 6 feet tall and half an inch.
Nothing further.
Cross-exam.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed, Your Honor?
May proceed.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Methvin. Mr. Methvin, you said when you were deposed that the whole incident was over in a matter of seconds, right?
Most things like this are, yeah.
And so that would be from the first shot to the last shot, matter of seconds, correct?
Yes.
Let's review this step by step, starting with the first shot. When the motorcycle cops approached your car, the first shot was fired by you, right?
As I said, yes.
Just to be totally clear, you didn't fire a warning shot into the air, did you?
Well, that's not our line of work, so no.
And you didn't shoot it into the ground, did you?
No, sir.
In fact, you took aim at the law enforcement officer who was approaching you and pulled the trigger. Is that right?
Yeah, I aimed.
Now, when you were pointing your weapon at this innocent police officer, Bonnie Parker was asleep in the car, right?
Well, I wasn't staring at her, but she might have been sleeping before. But when the cops approached, Clyde and I, we did make a ruckus, so I assume she would have woken up unless somebody had knocked her out when I wasn't watching.
If you don't mind, I'm going to show you an example from your deposition. If you look at the portion that's highlighted next to the number 6, would you please read the part that's highlighted right there, sir?
Yes. I cursed our luck and gently shook Clyde's shoulder, saying, "Hey, man, we got some trouble. A couple of cops saw us from the highway. Tried to be as quiet as possible because I didn't want to wake Bonnie."
So, to be clear, Bonnie was asleep then, right, sir?
Well, I tried to be quiet. Doesn't mean I was.
Then, according to your testimony, after you and Clyde exited the car, Mr. Barrow starts firing his shotgun, correct?
If he was indeed firing warning shots before I was told by him, is that what you asking me?
What I'm asking you is, after you fired the first shot, the next shots were fired by Mr. Barrow. Is that right, sir?
Correct. After he told me to take the cop and shot him, he proceeded to fire.
According to your testimony, Mr. Barrow shot both of the officers, correct?
Yes, but he did not kill the second officer.
After his barrage of shooting, one officer was dead and one was alive, correct?
Yes.
And only then did you see Ms. Parker emerge from the car, correct?
Yeah, she did more than emerge. Yes.
And indeed, you testified that when she did emerge from the car, she was smoking a cigar, right?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to change the subject for a moment. I'm going to ask you a few questions about how you ended up in Grapevine, Missouri in the first place.
Okay.
When you first met Mr. Barrow, the date was January 16, 1934, correct?
Clyde?
Yes, sir, Clyde Barrow. When you first met him, it was January 16, 1934, correct?
I suppose that's correct.
And you were in Texas, correct?
Yes.
Specifically, you were incarcerated at the Easton Prison Farm, correct?
Yes.
And you were there serving a 10-year sentence for armed robbery, correct?
I was.
When you met Mr. Barrow, it was during an assault on the prison, correct?
Yes, sir. I would say liberation of the prison.
Liberation of the prisoners. During this liberation, a prison guard was murdered, correct?
I didn't have time to turn and look.
Would it surprise you to learn that a prison guard was murdered?
Doesn't surprise me, no.
And another officer was injured, correct?
if you assert so.
Would it surprise you to learn that in your previous testimony you stated that you assaulted an officer during this liberation?
Well, I mean, it was kind of confusing. Have you ever been in a prison escape council? You don't really know. When a man comes at you and tries to stop you from your freedom, you don't let him stop you.
So would it surprise you to learn that you testified, this guard decided to be a hero. He grabbed his gun and had a clear shot at Clyde, but I knocked him over the head with a frying pan before he could get his shot off.
Well, I mean, I'm not in a Walt Disney motion picture cartoon. I hit him with something, yes. Probably.
And that something was previously testified to by you as being a frying pan. Is that correct, sir?
That's what I had. That's what I hit him with.
And after this frying pan to the head incident, you escaped from prison, correct?
Yes.
And you escaped along with a few other inmates, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Barrow invited all of you to join his criminal gang, isn't that right?
He did.
Other than you, all the escapees declined this generous offer, correct?
There was only two other gentlemen, yeah.
And you, on the other hand, chose to join the gang, correct?
Seemed like a swell idea.
Just to be clear, Ms. Parker was not present at this prison break, was she?
I don't believe so.
Is it fair to say that you realized after escaping Eastern Prison Farm on January 16th that Texas authorities desired to recapture you?
Well, I am Henry Methvin, so yes, I knew they were.
And you realized that if you were caught, you would be forced to serve the remainder of your 10-year armed robbery sentence, correct?
That's what I would have thought, yeah.
And you realized that if you were caught, you'd likely be charged with assaulting a prison guard, correct?
If indeed I did, I suppose it would charge me.
And you realized that if you were caught, you'd likely be charged with unlawful escape from confinement, correct?
Is that what they call it?
It is.
Okay, I think I would then.
And also, fair to say that you realized that if you were caught, you might be charged in relation to the death of the prison guard who was murdered during that escape, correct?
I think so. Is that right?
Between January 16th and April 1st, 1934, do you happen to suffer any serious head injuries?
Well, that's hard to say. I suffer a lot of head injuries all the time. But probably, yeah.
Were you diagnosed with amnesia?
I don't know what that is, but I don't think so.
I'm just wondering if it's fair to say that on April 1st, 1934, about 2.5 months after the prison break on January 16th, the day you aimed your weapon at a Missouri officer and pulled the trigger, you still remembered the legal problems you had in Texas. You had not forgotten them in that amount of time.
Well, I wasn't thinking about them all the time, but I think if I would have sat down, I would have remembered. Yeah.
And it's also fair to say that on April 1st, 1934, the day you aimed your weapon at a Missouri officer and pulled the trigger, you knew that if you were caught by Missouri authorities, you'd likely be returned to Texas. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes, sir.
And that if returned to Texas, you'd be looking at a serious stretch of prison time, sir, right?
I suppose.
Let's return for a moment to this escape from the Eastern Prison Farm. When you decided to smack the prison guard upside the head with a metal pan, the officer was attempting to thwart the prison escape, correct?
Yes, sir.
Indeed, the officer had a clear shot at Mr. Barrow, correct?
If you say so.
I didn't say so, sir. You said so. Let me remind you. You can just write the sentence beginning with, he grabbed.
He grabbed his gun and had a clear shot, yeah.
He had a clear shot at Clyde, but I knocked him over the head.
That's why I hit him.
And Mr. Barrow was thankful, correct?
I think that's why he wanted me in this gang.
Once you joined the gang, you committed additional crimes, correct?
Yes, sir.
Specifically on February 19, about 1 month after your escape, you and Mr. Barrow stole guns and ammunition from a National Guard armory in Texas, correct?
Yep.
During the theft from the National Guard armory, you were armed, correct?
Well, yeah.
And if necessary, you were prepared to use your weapon that day, correct?
Prepared to use it, that's what we had him, yes.
So if it became necessary to use your weapon to prevent being caught and returned to Texas, you were ready to do so, sir, right?
Well, it was more about getting the guns. I wasn't thinking about Texas.
About 1 week after that, on February 27, you and Mr. Barrow robbed a bank in Lancaster, Texas, correct?
Yes.
During the bank robbery, you were armed, correct?
Yes.
And if necessary, on that day, you were also prepared to use your weapon, correct, sir?
Well, it's more about making the people give you the money so you don't have to use the gun. So that's usually what we try to do.
Questions of bank robber theory aside, if it became necessary to use the gun, were you prepared to use it, sir?
I'm always ready to use what I have in my hand.
A few more questions about Ms. Parker. Before the events of April 1st, 1934, in Grapevine, you'd never seen Ms. Parker shoot anyone, correct?
That's correct.
You'd never seen her assault a law enforcement officer with a frying pan, correct, sir?
No, I didn't.
In fact, you'd never seen her assault any law enforcement officer in any way, correct?
No.
I'd like to ask you about a couple of items found at the murder scene. You have a cigar still? You testified that this is the cigar that was found at the scene, or at least that it wouldn't surprise you to learn that it was, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. And you testified that this was the whiskey bottle found at the scene, or at least that it looks similar to the one you were drinking out of that day, right?
Looks a lot like it, yeah.
You've been told you're a particularly violent drunk, correct?
People might have spouted such lies.
Let's turn for a moment to the period after the murders in Grapevine. You were arrested a few days afterward, correct?
Yes, sir.
Sometime after your arrest, you were informed that you were facing the death penalty for the murders, correct?
Oh, I remember that, yes.
And now that you've agreed to testify against Ms. Parker, the prosecution has agreed not to seek your execution, correct?
Well, it gave me an opportunity to tell the truth. So wouldn't you take it?
Got nothing further for this man, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Yes, Your Honor, briefly. Mr. Methvin, you just testified here today that you were in a car with Bonnie Parker. You were drinking, and she was drinking. Is that correct?
Yes, we were all drinking.
How drunk was Ms. Parker?
Well, apparently she was drunk enough to not hear the police coming. She was pretty drunk.
Was she drunk enough that she needed to suck on lemon peels to keep the alcohol off her breath?
Well, I mean, she always kind of did that when we were drinking whiskey. So I guess so, yeah.
Was she drunk enough that she passed out?
I mean, seems no other way why she would have passed out. I mean, we were sitting around drinking.
Did she appear drunk to you when she emerged from the car with a weapon and fired it into the officer's head?
Well, see, no, it's a lot different when somebody comes out with a gun with the intention to use it. She looked like she knew exactly what she wanted to do with that gun, and she did it. And she laughed when she did.
Did she say anything?
Well, I know when she was shooting the officer, she told us that, well, in the middle of her laughing pretty maniacally, I just learned that word, she said his head bounced like a rubber ball, and that was when it hit the pavement.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Your Honor, if I might have a brief recross. During the redirect, the man directly contradicted his deposition testimony.
Briefly.
Thank you, Your Honor, for your latitude. I appreciate it. Sir, would it surprise you to learn that you testified with respect to what you may or may not have heard during the shooting of the officer? Standing so close to Clyde while he had shot his shotgun had made me temporarily deaf.
Well, in that ear.
Would it surprise you to learn that you testified, it looked as if she was laughing while she did it, but I can't be certain, and that sentence was immediately followed by, standing so close to Clyde when he had shot his shotgun had made me temporarily deaf.
Yeah, well, she was laughing in that ear. But, you see, she laughed, and then she said something there's a difference there. She
I've got nothing
paused.
further for this witness, Your Honor.
You may step down, sir. State, call your next witness.
Your Honor, the state would like to play the video deposition of Officer Polk Ivy.
Officer Ivy, can you please state your name?
If the miraculous motion picture box will work.
Is this going to be one of those talking pictures?
It is.
Officer Ivy, can you please state your name for the record?
Yes, my name is Officer Polk Ivy. I'm a senior officer with the Missouri State Motorcycle Patrol.
Officer Ivy, what were you doing on the day of April 1st, 1934?
I was on patrol that Easter Sunday with E.B. Wheeler and H.D. Murphy. While Officer Wheeler had been a patrolman for roughly 4 years, this was Officer Murphy's first day out of the office. Wheeler and I were kind of showing him the ropes, as it were.
Now, what was the weather like on that day, April 1st, 1934?
It was sunny and clear, and a cloud in the sky.
What were you patrolling for at that time?
For the most part, we were cruising up and down Highway 114 near Grapevine.
And anything of interest happened on that day?
Yes, that was the day Officers Wheeler and Murphy were killed,
When did this incident occur?
around 3:30 in the afternoon.
You're not sure?
Not exactly.
Why not?
Well, around that time, Officers Wheeler, Murphy, and myself were driving on Highway 114, as I already said. I was in the lead. As we passed the intersection of Dove Road, I noticed a fancy brand new black Ford V8 with yellow rims sitting on the shoulder about 100 yards down Dove Road.
Why was it that you noticed this Ford V8?
Well, it was a pretty fancy car, and we live in a pretty rural area. I just took note of it.
What happened after that?
Well, I kept driving for a couple of miles till I heard a loud boom in the distance. I turned around and discovered that Officers Wheeler and Murphy were no longer behind me.
Did you know where they were?
Not at that time. No.
What did you do next?
I turned around and raced back up Highway 114 the way I'd come. I was concerned.
Why were you concerned?
Well, I figured that they would have only stopped following me if they had seen something worth checking out. And I remembered the brand new black Ford V8 was the only thing of significance that I saw after I heard the boom in the distance and noticed that Wheeler and Murphy were missing.
So you drove to the intersection of Dove Road and Highway 114.
Yes, as fast as I could.
What did you find when you arrived?
Officers Wheeler and Murphy were dead in the streets. Bullet casings were everywhere. The Ford V8 was gone. Tire tracks showed the direction the car had fled.
What was your initial impression of what had happened?
Well, I figured Officers Murphy and Wheeler had exited Highway 114 to check out the Ford V8, and that they must have surprised who was ever in the car, and that they were killed down before they even had a chance to shoulder their weapons.
Why do you think Officer Wheeler and Murphy did not have time to shoulder their weapons?
Well, Officer Wheeler's shotgun was still fastened to his motorcycle, and his sidearm was still fastened to his belt. He was laying directly next to the motorcycle with his left foot still resting on the peg of the bike. He had massive wounds in the chest and head.
What about Officer Murphy's condition?
Officer Murphy's body lay a couple yards away from his bike. His dead body was grasping the shotgun that he had taken off his bike, but it was unloaded. Officer Murphy's cargo pocket in his pants was unfastened and missing some shotgun shells, which were scattered on the road around him. Officer Murphy, sadly, did not carry a sidearm.
Based on your observations of Officer Murphy and Officer Wheeler's bodies, what do you think occurred?
I think Officer Wheeler must have been shot, bringing his bike to a stop. Officer Murphy must have disengaged his shotgun from the motorcycle and attempted to load it with the shells from his pants pocket before being killed down.
What did you do next?
I called for backup and continued to investigate the scene.
What else did you discover during the course of that investigation?
I found several bullet casings.
Do you remember the model and number of casings you found?
Of course I do. Wouldn't you when 2 officers die? I found 3 16-gauge shotgun shells, 5 45 caliber auto shells, 3 12-gauge shotgun shells, and 1 BAR shell.
What type of shotgun does the Missouri State Highway Motorcycle Patrol officer carry?
We traditionally carry 12-gauge shotguns.
Did you find anything else of note at the crime scene?
Near the bodies I found an empty whiskey bottle with a man's thumbprint on it, some chewed lemon peels, and a cigar with small teeth marks.
Were you present when Bonnie and Clyde were arrested on April 4th, 1934?
Yes, I was the senior officer present during the arrest.
What kind of weaponry did you find in the vehicle that Bonnie and Clyde were arrested in?
It was a virtual arsenal of weapons. They had multiple Browning automatic rifles, a 20-gauge shotgun, a 10-gauge shotgun, a 32 caliber automatic pistol, a 380 caliber pistol, several 45 caliber pistols, and several hundred rounds of machine gun clips, and thousands of rounds of ammunition.
Thank you, Officer Ivey. There are no further questions.
Thank you.
Does the state have any further evidence?
We don't, Your Honor. State rests.
The state having rested, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're going to take a 10-minute recess at this time. We will stand in recess until 3 minutes after 9 by the clock on the wall. The court will stand in recess.